Hello, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I am your host, Dalia Gebrial, and joining me today is the wonderful Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, how are you doing, girl?
I'm doing very, very well. Thank you. Excellent to have the dream team back together 2 weeks running and looking forward to the show this evening.
Dream team indeed. So what will the dream team be discussing tonight? We have the media's reaction to better European cooperation with China. Another House of Lords member is caught up in a lobbying scandal, and Ash Sarkar pours cold water on the two-tier policing row on Politics Live. The leaders of all 27 European Union countries have been holding crisis talks in Brussels today. They're there to work out a pan-European defence plan after all the signs from Washington suggest the continent will lose US military backing as the country's president Donald Trump seeks a realignment with Russia. And Russia is very much in the minds of those EU leaders, the bloc's greatest threat, spurring on European plans to rearm the continent. In a television address last night, French President Emmanuel Macron appeared to sound the drums of war.
Russia, through all this time, is continuing to arm, spending more than 40% of its budget to that end. By 2030, Russia plans to increase its army to have 300,000 additional soldiers, 3,000 extra jet fighters. Who can believe that in this context, Russia will stop at Ukraine? Russia has become and will remain a threat to France and Europe. It is something I deeply regret. But in the long term, peace will return to our continent with a pacified Russia. But we have to look at the situation before us. To remain a spectator in this dangerous world would be crazy.
Macron appears to be positioning himself as leader of the EU's new defence strategy. And that's not an overly ambitious pitch. France has perhaps the most powerful military in the bloc. And it's also its only nuclear power, a topic Macron also touched on in his speech.
Our nuclear deterrent helps us. It is comprehensive. It is a sovereign deterrent, French from beginning to end. And since 1964, it's always played a role in preserving peace and security in Europe. The future German Chancellor has called for a strategic debate on providing that same protection from deterrent to our European allies. Whatever happens, the decision will be in the hands of the President of the Republic and the heads of the army.
That was a reference to the possibility of France expanding its so-called nuclear umbrella to European allies. Now, if all this talk of Russia and an expanded nuclear deterrent is taking you back to the Cold War, it gets worse. Speaking in Brussels today, former President of the European Council and current Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk told reporters this. There is no doubt that the war in Ukraine, the new approach of the American administration to Europe, and the arms race started by Russia pose completely new challenges to us. Europe must join this arms race and win it. I am convinced that Russia will lose this arms race just as the Soviet Union lost a similar arms race 40 years ago. And this, the new arms race, is a similar method to avoid a wider, large-scale conflict. Europe as a whole is really able to win any financial, economic, military confrontation with Russia. We are simply stronger. We just had to start believing in it. And today, it is probably happening. Manifesting our way into World War III. How fantastic. I'm filled with confidence. Across Europe, countries are pledging vast amounts of money for rearmament. New German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has pledged to tweak Germany's constitution in order to remove rules limiting borrowing, freeing up 500 billion euros for defence. Others are also increasing civil defence planning. The Dutch government has recommended citizens get 72-hour emergency kits to help them survive cyber attacks, disaster, and war. The Dutch Justice Minister also said he would like Dutch society to return to a Cold War level of preparedness. Also appearing at the Brussels summit was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And standing with him was European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen, who gave her view on the crisis talks.
We want a peaceful strength And this is the reason why I present today to the leaders the Rearm Europe plan. The Rearm Europe plan provides up to 800 billion euros for defense investment. It gives the member states fiscal space to invest in defense. It gives the member states possibility to invest in the Ukrainian defense industry or to procure military capabilities that go right away to Ukraine.
Now, all of that is, of course, music to the defense sector's ears. Arms firms across Europe have added billions to their value as European countries pledge even ever greater sums for rearmament. And Labour MPs are trying to boost the fortunes of arms companies too. Over 100 Labour MPs and peers have written to British banks and fund managers asking them to stop classing arms companies as unethical in an effort to boost the UK arms industry. If arms dealers are not unethical investments, I actually don't know what possibly is. Anyway, Helena, what do you make of all of these numbers, these billions and billions of euros being thrown around to potentially enter a military confrontation with Russia at a time when poverty, inequality in Europe is pretty high?
So when it comes to the initial claim from Donald Tusk there was that this idea that Europe as a collective, I guess mostly the NATO states without the USA, being stronger than Russia, this claim is basically already correct. So that we look at things like total kind of nominal military spending, for example, total GDP, international influence, Europe is probably stronger than Russia in most of these metrics. I think the only real metric in which Russia kind of comes out on top in comparison to European Union countries and, of course, NATO countries, once you include the UK, they only just come out on top then, even though that's with a lot of reservists. And when you look at it in more holistic terms, the Russian threat, as it is being discussed here, it's invaded Ukraine. It's attempted to try and take all 4 of the oblasts in the southeast of the country and in the east of the country, which is the Donbass and then Zaporizhia and Kherson after annexing Crimea in 2014. And they've gotten halfway through in 3 years, when the initial attempt was to send military columns down to Kyiv to be able to take it in a matter of weeks. None of these things came to pass. They've barely been able to get through a Ukrainian defense, which of course has been backed up by military support from largely the European Union countries and the United States. And they've not been able to have their shock and awe tactic of being able to win over this conflict quickly. And they've been sitting around in an incredibly long and protracted conflict where they've not been successful. And this is against one country that doesn't even have a particularly well-advanced or particularly well-staffed military. So even at current levels of military spending, within European countries, this idea that Russia poses a threat outside of a nuclear threat, which I don't think Russia would ever be stupid enough to pull the trigger on, I think that's basically already true. So this idea that somehow we need to have a further expansion of expenditure on military capacity and arms manufacturing, I find that a little bit hard to believe. I'm not a pacifist. I don't believe in not having any army or any defense at all. I don't think anybody who's watching today does believe that. And I think that especially in the UK, our current level of spending is absolutely fine in terms of keeping us protected when it comes to geopolitical threats. Remember, in the UK specifically, it's closer to home here outside of the EU, we already have the 5th highest nominal military expenditure globally, you know? And I don't think anyone's coming to aid Russia if they were going to try and engage in some belligerent conflict with the European Union or NATO more broadly that triggered Article 5. I don't think that's something that's going to happen. I don't think anyone would come to their aid to fight what would be an unwinnable war for Russia in the slightest. So all of this discussion about how much extra we need to spend, how much extra we need to cut from other budgets to be able to fund military expenditure. And I don't buy this for 1 second. Maybe we need to beef up cybersecurity. I feel like that maybe is the one area in which I would be absolutely happy to see more expenditure on, because that's definitely going to be classified as defense spending. If all you're doing is beefing up your own cybersecurity protection, that's worth doing in my mind, given that a lot of the war is happening through cyber attacks right now. Whereas conventional military conflict between the EU or NATO and Russia, I find that to be very unbelievable, despite all of the saber rattling that's going on within European Union nations right now. What I would say is when it comes to the idea of military Keynesianism, so Germany suspending its debt break rules to engage in extra rearmament, to engage in extra military expenditure, just shows you that those fiscal rules, right? We've heard that term a lot over the past year, the fiscal rules that have been in place in Germany, and of course, more broadly within the European Union too. There is the excessive deficit protocol and things like that stops for a bunch of deficit spending being engaged in by European Union states. There's only sort of at least relaxed somewhat to engage in lockdown and pandemic expenditure over the past few years, which is something that we have been extricated from post-Brexit. Not that any of the governments since have been able to do anything with that, because they've all adhered to the same silly fiscal rules at the start, right? Regardless whether you think that the military expenditure is a good justification of this, I think there is a reasonable justification to say that the austerity politics of European Union, and of course, to a lesser extent, British politics, with regards to the level of actual constraints rather than self-imposed constraints that you get from Rachel Reeves and Jeremy Hunt's fiscal rules, shows you that there was no point in doing this. All this has done is hamper broadly European economies when America's running a 7% deficit, or at least it was under Joe Biden, and has been seeing an economic miracle outside of, when it comes to macro policy, of course. When it comes to individual policy, I don't think many people on the ground are seeing the benefits of that. But growth has been pretty high in America because of this deficit spending, which we haven't really had in Europe because of these self-imposed fiscal rules. So that could always have been done in service for welfare expenditure or for critical infrastructure. This could always have been done to benefit people who weren't arms manufacturers. So why didn't we do it before now? Why have we been waiting for a military justification for this expenditure? And one last point I would make, which is that when we talk about this existential threat that Russia poses to Europe and Vladimir Putin, this threat that we're being told that he poses, why was this never a concern when we were aiding or when we were happy to ally with Russia when they were committing war crimes in Chechnya in the 2000s? Why did Blair in that period say, we need to ally with Russia to stop Islamism, for example? Why have we not, like, for example, someone like Jeremy Corbyn, noticed the belligerence of Russia before now? And it's only when it comes to our own European borders that suddenly it becomes this big problem. On a postcard.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I mean, also not even just thinking about the ways in which geopolitically those allegiances have been made, but also the fact that Russian oligarchs have basically turned our housing system into a casino. That alongside the fact that these self-imposed fiscal rules could not be broken, despite the fact that we have had, nearly 20 years of austerity that has plunged millions of people into poverty, into a lower quality of life. For the first time since the war, we have this generation is worse off than the generation before it. And the fact that throughout all that time, the fiscal rules could not be broken or could not be adjusted because of these arbitrary ideas around what the economy is and what is possible according to the natural laws of the market or the natural laws of an economy. And then the minute that it comes to something that, is not just about imperial expansion, but is also about, enriching the military industrial complex, which is one of the most profitable private industries out there, it's a bit of a slap in the face that not only could you not raise that money and prioritize things like a proper green industrial revolution, a proper welfare state, something that meets the moment of the climate emergency, that not only could you find the money for war, but not for the things that actually have really mattered to people in the past 20 years, but also now you are trying to reimpose that austerity on people in the name of saving up enough money to fund this rearmament. I mean, it just goes to show that the entire, all of this discourse about what is possible with our economy, the dominant framing of how our economy functions, is wired with the perception that our economy exists solely to make private industry really wealthy, people in private industry really wealthy. It doesn't exist to house us, to feed us, to educate us, to build a true society. An economic decision can only be justified if some already rich people are going to get a lot richer. So yeah, Helena, I think you summed that up really well. So across the Atlantic, the diplomatic tide continues to turn against Ukraine. Last night, Secretary of State Marco Rubio appeared on Fox News to talk about the war.
It's been very clear from the beginning that President Trump views this as a protracted, stalemated conflict. And frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine and Russia. And it needs to come to an end. And no one has any idea or any plan to bring it to an end. The plan of the Ukrainians up to now and their allies on Capitol Hill and the people you talk to in other countries is, let's just keep giving them as much as they need for as long as it takes. That's not a strategy.
For those of you who, unlike me, didn't go to a Catholic primary school, that is the Ash Wednesday cross on Marco Rubio's forehead, just in case you were wondering. But it's pretty bizarre to hear the phrase proxy war come out of the mouth of one of the most senior politicians of a country that's supposedly one of the belligerents in that war. That's not usually the kind of thing empire admits. But even more bizarrely, the other belligerent agrees. Russian government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said this about Rubio's remarks. We can and want to agree with it, and we agree with it. That's the way it is. We have said this repeatedly. We have said that this is actually a conflict between Russia and the collective West, and the main country of the collective West is the United States of America. So it's absolutely in line with the position that our president and foreign minister have repeatedly expressed. We have said this repeatedly, and yes, we agree that it is time to stop this conflict and this war. Now, you might think this is an alarming outbreak of honesty amongst two imperial powers, or you might think that taking ownership of the war is just a handy way for both powers to exclude Ukraine from peace negotiations. But either way, seeing the two sides in almost scripted agreement is even more evidence of an emerging new alliance. And however you understand this war, there can be no doubt that ordinary Ukrainians have suffered an enormous amount and will continue to suffer, just as disposable pieces in an imperial game of chess. Reports have now emerged that Trump intends to deport around 240,000 Ukrainian refugees from the US as soon as April. The Telegraph reports this. The move would be an extraordinary reversal of the welcome Ukrainians received under Joe Biden, the former president, amid the Trump's administration's rapidly fraying support towards Kyiv. The planned rollback of protections for Ukrainians was underway before Mr. Trump's ugly row with Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office last week, a senior Trump official and 3 sources familiar with the matter have said. It is part of a broader Trump administration effort to strip legal status from more than 1.8 million migrants allowed to enter the US under temporary humanitarian parole programs launched under the Biden administration, the sources said. Helena, it's quite interesting. Back when the war drums were beating for the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war, we were told that the reason is, it's nothing to do with kind of imperialism. It's nothing to do with power grabs, oil, resources, etc. It's, our love of women's rights and democracy. And so in order to implement women's rights and democracy, you have to bomb the living daylights out of someone. Do you kind of prefer this more kind of honest imperialism where it's like, no, this is about, power blocks and resources and oil and, agriculture and all of these things? Is that, in a sense, is this, silver lining extremely thin here? But is that a kind of an easier thing to grapple with?
I mean, it makes, trying to impart kind of a leftist principles to people who otherwise would believe the propaganda a lot easier when the parties at play are being open and honest about their intentions with regards to what's happening here. It's very interesting the point you make about, we're going into these countries to fight for the rights of women, etc. Well, if that was the case, why did we arm the Taliban or the Mujahideen against at least the communists in Afghanistan when they were the ones who were promoting women's rights? And we were funding the people who got rid of women's rights. Then we have to go and invade later to then restore the women's rights that we helped take away, which again people would understand if they underneath the imperial interest in the Great Game of Afghanistan before now, but nevertheless, that's by the by. But I find it quite interesting that Marco Rubio is willing to admit and say, "Oh, this is a proxy war the United States has been engaging in Ukraine, for example." My assumption here is that he's saying this broadly because he wants to be able to paint the Biden administration as being pro-war in this regard and trying to paint them as being different and say, well, if Trump is the peace president here, he's the one who wants to get the US out of international conflicts, don't want to be the world police anymore. So we're going to paint this as entirely being the fault of the previous administration for internal political reasons. That would make sense, why you would be so open about it, because at the end of the day, the Trump campaign and the Trump platform is about maintaining that political party power. And that's why people like Rubio have been put into positions of power within that administration is to be able to engage in the kind of internal democratic, or the internal positioning that would be democratically viable for the Republican Party more broadly. But you can't just admit, oh, well, it was a proxy war, we are at least partially at fault for the war happening, and then saying, but also all of these refugees, all these Ukrainian refugees who need our help, they're none of our concern anymore. Fuck off, go away, leave, we don't want you here anymore. Well, hang on a minute, you've just admitted that the US is at least partially at fault for this. If you do personally believe your proxy war claims to be true, Marco, so you can't just then say, well, all of the people whose lives have been upended by this conflict, you're on your own. You can't be here anymore. It's a staggering level of inhumanity to just kick refugees out of the country along with all the other people who you're also kicking out as well, just as inhumanely, of course. I'm sure there'll be plenty of liberals who will get very angry at the idea of refugees from Ukraine being kicked out of the US, but have been suspiciously quiet on the other mass deportations that have been proposed by the US government under Donald Trump. There is also the problem, of course, is that they keep ramping up this idea of deportations, and there's going to be this huge recessionary effect in the United States by massively reducing the population, especially the working age population in that country that drives a lot of growth for the labor pool to be able to increase productive capacity in that country. And we're already seeing a predicted, 3% drop in GDP over the next quarter in the United States. Current predictions, just under 3%. There's a giant recession that's coming around the corner in the United States economy. And what's the reason for this? Well, of course, as soon as the recession happens, unemployment goes up, people have to sell their assets. Who's going to buy all those assets? Oh yeah, it's going to be all of the oligarchs who are backing the Trump campaign. This is why they're helping engineer a recession and using this kind of this jingoistic America First rhetoric to justify inhumane mass deportations of people from all stripes who they deem to be un-American. Pretty grim.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also just kind of shows how the kind of refugee and immigration, particularly refugee and asylum legislation, is being kind of used as a geopolitical weapon. It's here, Ukraine was seen as an ally. Palestinians are not seen as an ally, so Palestinians don't get the same refugee settlement as Ukrainians, even though they are both, on the receiving end of invasions of their country by a much more powerful neighbor. And in the US, it's like once the geopolitical tide turns, then suddenly all of these, rights that are meant to be enshrined for refugees and asylum seekers that Ukrainians had access to at one point gets overturned. And it shows that our system does not treat all refugees equally, even within the same group of refugees, if the geopolitical tide turns, they can find themselves overnight in a very, very difficult situation. A member of the House of Lords has been caught on camera offering private companies the opportunity to have secure meetings with ministers and civil servants. Lord Richard Dannatt was secretly filmed talking to undercover reporters posing as property developers who were trying to get on the government on side with their plan to convert high street department stores into flats and shops. Here he is telling them what he thought the property developers should do to get their voice heard in government.
Whether I'm better placed is, particularly as you're concerned that the current government might be thinking of changing legislation, is because I don't know at the present moment, is quite easily see who the minister in the House of Lords is that deals with these things, who I may or may not know, because I don't know who it is, but I can easily arrange to meet them and say, I'm involved with this or that company that's wanting to do these things, which to me seems to make a lot of sense. Previous governments rather liked it. What is your attitude? So I can make those connections.
So there's Lord Dannatt basically saying, if we agree to work together, I'm going to go ahead and identify which minister you need to talk to, and I'm going to start cozying up to them. Now, members of the House of Lords are actually banned from contacting ministers, officials, MPs, or other peers on behalf of paying clients. That would, to me at least, include offering to introduce those paying clients to government ministers. And the Guardian report indicates that these fictitious property developers were basically supposed to be paying clients. The report quotes Dannatt as saying the following during their covertly recorded conversation. I'm assuming you're not inviting me to do this pro bono. I do quite a lot of things pro bono, but this is, my understanding, is a strictly commercial conversation. Now, the suggested day rate for that commercial conversation for Lord Dannatt's alleged services was between £1,800 and £2,800 per day. Bizarrely, this is not the first time Dannatt has been caught out on this issue by undercover reporters. In 2012, undercover reporters from the Sunday Times secretly filmed the former head of the British Army offering to lobby for what he thought was a South Korean arms manufacturer at the hefty fee of £100,000 per year for 2 days' work a month. He promised to get in touch with Bernard Gray, the then government's civilian chief of defence procurement, on their behalf. An investigation by the Lords authorities found that Lord Dannatt had not broken the rules, but it was still a major and rather humiliating media affair. And this time round, he even began his call with the undercover Guardian reporters by saying that he was, quote, very wary and nervous and did not want a repeat of the, quote, extraordinarily embarrassing episode. Yet in another of the videos published by The Guardian, he talks about another instance where he had arranged a meeting between a minister and a client looking to build a hydroelectric plant in Sierra Leone. That client also happened to be a company Lord Dannatt had a, quote, modest shareholding in.
I would have to do so on the basis that for transparency, I'm making the introduction on behalf of yourselves, because you believe you've got a commercial idea that's beneficial, which I think makes a lot of sense, and therefore I'm putting you forward. I mean, you mentioned the interests in West Africa. This was two young men who I felt were doing a really good job, and they were wanting to put together a major hydroelectric plant in Sierra Leone, which would transform the amount of electricity in Sierra Leone. I introduced them to the then Minister for Africa, and that got them an introduction into the British government and to the High Commission in Freetown in Sierra Leone, and they've gone forward from there. They haven't achieved the aim yet, because things don't happen overnight in West Africa.
Sure.
But I was able to do that. But I made it quite clear that the basis of this was a commercial undertaking, but I thought it was worthwhile and reasonable, and therefore I was prepared to help them.
Now, Dannatt denies any wrongdoing, telling The Guardian this. I'm well aware of the Lord's Code of Conduct. I have always acted on my personal honour. I said at the outset that I need to be transparent in anything that I did for a commercial company. It's worth mentioning that The Guardian contacted 11 peers to see if they would join an advisory board for the fictitious company to, quote, better understand the political landscape and make the introductions both within government and the opposition. 6 peers did not respond or decline the offer. 2 others responded but didn't meet with the fictitious company. 1 said they were unsure and would have to check the rules, and the other said they would only attend if their lawyers were present. So essentially, Lord Dannatt was the only one of the 11 to agree. Now, the Guardian article is part of their broader project investigating so-called cash for access in the House of Lords. The project so far has found that nearly 100 peers were paid to give political advice to commercial companies. This includes Labour peer Lord David Evans, who offered another fictitious property developer company access to ministers and other peers for cash. Now, Helena, is the problem that peers are breaking the rules or that the rules themselves are not strict enough? Because I personally am quite confused about how, when this happened in 2012, Lord Dannatt was not found guilty of any wrongdoing, but then it seems like the rules say that introducing a paying client to a minister is breaching the rules. So I'm a bit confused because it seems to me that what he did in 2012 or 2013, based on what my understanding of the rules, was clearly not kosher. But the investigation said that he was fine. So is the problem with the rules or is it the problem with the peers? Or, and I presume you're going to agree with this, both?
I mean, yeah, I think it is both. And I think that your analysis there about the rules clearly not being strict enough, if we can have the letter of the rules being stated in the way that it has been in 2012, but the actual ways in which that they are implemented means that he can do what he did and get away with it, essentially, shows you that the rules need to be tighter. The rules absolutely need to be tighter if this is a thing that's happening, because again, people are there to represent the interests of the people of this country as a collective and not the individual interests of certain companies, of certain commercial interests, for example, right? That is a direct conflict of interest between the stated role of representatives within Parliament and the actual actions that they undertake as parliamentary figures. That is a huge problem and a huge conflict of interest. I think the biggest problem broadly, both in the Commons and the Lords in this country, is that when it comes to the idea of having a conflict of interest, what we do is we say, well, all you have to do is show people that you have one, and then people can make their own decisions on that. And then there's this level of plausible deniability where you'll say, well, the rules are this way. I know full well what the rules are. Okay, well, you can know what the rules are and still skirt them, right? Whether or not this makes you've broken the rules, whether or not this means that this is something that is technically within them because you've done it in a certain way or through a certain channel, right? At the end of it, there's a spirit behind all of these rules. There's an ethical position here, which isn't necessarily something that's covered by a set of regulations on how they are allowed to act, and is more of a broader question of what do we think is their role and how should they act, right? Like the letter of the law has always been something that has never really been a legislation of morality, as much as loads of people try to believe that it is. And so I'm not interested really in whether or not we are considering them having broken the rules as being the important point of inflection here, rather than, as you say, is something kosher? Does it pass the vibe check, so to speak? This doesn't pass any vibe check to me. I don't know about anybody else who's watching today. This feels absolutely, really does not pass the vibe check in the slightest. And the biggest problem, of course, is that when it comes to the House of Commons, at the very least, even with our kind of thin veneer of having a conflict of interest being provided to the public more broadly, at least you can vote them out. At least you can vote out a member of the House of Commons, right? They can do these things. They can skirt around the rules. They can, again, not act in the spirit of what a legislator should be doing, which is legislating for the people broadly within the country, the interests of the country more broadly, rather than a narrow set of interests that conflict with that remit that they have as a member of our legislature. You can at least, be exposed broadly to the public, and they can vote out if they don't want to. But the Lords, they're completely unelected. They're all appointed, mostly. And some of them aren't even appointed. They're just there by birthright, for example, like the bishops. So there's nothing there in the slightest, to me, that makes this seem like a system that is functional in any way. And if this kind of stuff continues to happen, then the only solution is to replace the Lords completely. I mean, you know me, I've always been in favour of House of Lords reform and abolishing the House of Lords to create a second elected chamber of the regions, something that was a plan that Labour had before the election. I wonder where that pledge went, Keir. Just another one lying on the cutting room floor, which is the only way of at least adding some democratic accountability to these people's actions. Otherwise, no matter how strict you make the rules, they will always find a way of being able to get around them. And so you have to make people democratically accountable by the end of the day.
Labour are being accused of promoting a two-tier policing system. This follows recommendations by the Sentencing Council to consider pre-sentencing reports for defendants who are women or from ethnic or religious minorities. Now, for those who don't know, pre-sentencing reports are essentially documents written by probation officers following an interview with the defendant and given to judges to help inform their sentencing decision. These reports are optional. They can be requested by the court or a defense lawyer if deemed necessary. Now, the purpose of pre-sentencing reports is to give judges a bigger picture of the defendant's personal history. They may inform, for example, whether it is more appropriate to impose a custodial or a community sentence. Now, the Sentencing Council, which is an independent body that creates sentencing guidelines, has recommended that pre-sentencing reports should be considered necessary if the offender is one or more of the following. So here we've got at risk of first custodial sentence and or at risk of a custodial sentence of 2 years or less, a young adult, a woman, from an ethnic minority, cultural minority or faith minority community, pregnant or postnatal, sole or primary carer for dependent relatives, has disclosed that they are transgender, or they have addiction issues, or they have a serious chronic medical condition, physical disability, or mental ill health, learning disabilities, or brain injury / damage. So they also include victims of abuse, trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. Now, this has led up to outcry from Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick, who claims the absence of Christian, straight, and white men from this list is, quote, blatant bias. In response, Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood has stated that she also does not agree with the guidelines and wants them reversed. However, as the Sentencing Council is independent, she actually cannot mandate their reversal. Here was Robert Jenrick on Sky News earlier today.
The Sentencing Council published guidelines, which we uncovered, which showed that they were going to make changes to the way in which our courts operate, which is going to make it less likely for some groups to get a custodial sentence than others. So if you're a woman, if you're trans, if you're neurodiverse, if you're an ethnic minority, if you are from a minority faith group, which presumably means anyone who isn't Christian, then you would have a pre-sentencing report commissioned by a judge, which historically has meant that you tended to get a less strict sentence, less likely for it to be a custodial sentence. To me, this seems like blatant bias, particularly against Christians and against straight white men. And in a time when many people feel that there is creeping two-tier justice in this country, this seems only to confirm it and will be very corrosive to public trust and confidence in the criminal justice system.
Two things. Firstly, it's very interesting to me. This is a bit of a side note, but it's interesting to hear Robert Jenrick say there that pre-sentencing reports tend to mean less harsh punishments. To me, that speaks to the fact that when judges have more human context about a defendant, they tend to decide that putting them in prison is not actually going to lead to a better outcome for them or for the community. And that often jail does not actually address the root cause for why the person has committed a crime. And in some cases, it might actually worsen the root cause. But secondly, we should think about why the council did not include white or straight men in their list of pre-sentencing report candidates. Is it because of, an ideological hatred or bias against straight white Christian men? Or is it because ethnic minorities or those with mental health issues have historically been treated much more harshly by our criminal justice system than other groups? So let's have a look at the data. These figures are from the Ministry of Justice from 2017. And you can see here that basically at every stage of interaction with the criminal justice system, from stop and search through to arrests to prosecution and right through to sentencing, ethnic minorities are more likely to be treated harshly than their white counterparts. The data also shows that people of color are more likely to receive custodial sentences than community sentences. We also know that those with mental health conditions or who are neurodivergent are more likely to be criminalized or come into contact with the criminal justice system. So 1 in 3 people in the justice system are neurodivergent. 39% of people detained in police custody have a mental illness. And in the context of cuts to mental health and disability services, those who suffer from those issues receive very little support until they reach an acute crisis, at which point the police are brought in to solve a problem that they weren't designed to address. Now, another group on that list are women. Over half of women in prison are victims of domestic abuse, and more than half are therefore a non-violent crime. And what is true for all of these groups is that they are more likely to be in poverty, which is one of the leading causes of crime and is a problem that prison not only doesn't solve, but often makes worse. So whatever you think of these proposals, it seems that they are an attempt to redress some of the imbalances of the criminal justice system rather than an attack or a deliberate marginalization of a specific group of people. Now, what I would like to see is for everyone going through the justice system to have a pre-sentencing report. It makes sense that judges have all the context to hand when deciding whether putting someone in prison is actually the most effective way to prevent someone reoffending. But that's not what Robert Jenrick is arguing for. What Jenrick is doing is perpetuating this idea, which we heard a lot last year during the far-right riots, that the police are overly lenient on ethnic minorities and progressives. So you might remember the slogan, two-tier care, which Elon Musk and others used to condemn the policing of far-right protesters, in scare quotes, burning down hotels, sheltering asylum seekers, and throwing bricks through mosques. Now, that might be how Elon Musk feels, But it's actually not backed up by the facts, which consistently show that ethnic minorities, that progressive activists like climate protesters and other working class people are much more likely to face aggressive policing than anyone else. But I guess it's always nice to feel like a victim. And it's worth mentioning that the point of that this myth around two-tier policing is to basically say that ethnic minorities, migrants, refugees in particular, aren't being policed heavily or harshly or violently enough, which in the context of the fact that they are already disproportionately over-policed is basically it amounts to a call for a visible, violent policing of refugees, migrants, and ethnic minorities. But when, we're talking about right-wing spin, and who better to call that out than our very own Ash Sarkar, who discussed the topic on Politics Live today.
This is all complete rubbish. This is a misreported story.
Why is it misreported? What's misreported?
One is that the proposed changes are about pre-sentencing
reports. Yes, they're reports.
Pre-sentencing reports can't compel judges to make different
they are
decisions.
guidelines.
But what they do is they say, you have to consider this person's situation. I just find this really quite funny because I think that, again, this is a classic case of it wasn't particularly controversial last year. Right-wing media picked up on it. And now you've got politicians being like, oh, no, this is really awful. And this happens not just when it comes to issues like within, the MOJ. This happens with so many social issues.
But does that dispute sincerely held view that it might be a divisive and problematic?
So I think that if we look at it, which is, do you think that judges should have a lot of information about the individual before sentencing them? All of us agree, right? All of us also agree that there is a problem of resources. So what these recommendations are saying, well, why don't we start here with these groups? What I'm not hearing, and maybe you guys can tell me why, is if we know that people of colour disproportionately get harsher sentences than their white counterparts, even when being accused of the same crime, why shouldn't ethnicity be one of the places where we start for saying, all right, the judge needs a fuller picture of what led to you committing this offence?
Well, sentencing guidelines are an incredibly important tool, and there is an obligation for the judges to take those matters into consideration. The idea that your gender and your ethnicity should define the judgment made against you.
But it's not. It's the pre-sentencing report. That's not defining the judgment.
It is definitely influencing it. It is part of the paperwork.
Because it's saying, let's look at this person.
And there is a formula that requires the judge to take those matters into account. I don't think that someone should be judged on the basis of either their gender or their ethnicity.
Well, then
whether or not there are, and I do agree with you that there are rightly social issues that we need to address. Bending the judicial system is not the way to do that.
So that was Ash with Conservative Lord James Bethel. And look, I think Ash was completely right there. First of all, the entire framing of what these reports do is deliberately misleading. The idea that these are reports that, we've gone from, there are these pre-sentencing reports which have a long-standing precedent in our criminal justice system, have been part of our criminal justice system for a really long time. All that's happened is that this, independent counsel has said, we want to expand the groups of people that are entitled to a pre-sentencing report by default, the kind of the prerequisites, the requirements for these pre-sentencing reports. And that has percolated through the right-wing, talking point sphere into, oh my God, they're going to give white people, they're going to judge, they're going to see a white person walk through the court and they're going to say he gets an extra 3 years, that this is somehow like there's going to be stronger sentences for white people and black and brown people are going to be let off the hook. And it adds to this kind of right-wing, Enoch Powell style fantasy around the idea of, the black man having the whip over the white man, that, people of color, the ethnic minorities are running amok and they are lawless and they are, all the police are too scared of being called racist to go after them, even though the data by every single metric shows that the police are actually more than comfortable and much more comfortable going after ethnic minorities than basically any other group. So you have that obfuscation of what pre-sentencing reports are. And even at the end there, the Lord Bethel said, he said, bending the justice system or bending the judicial system is not the way to do that. As I said before, no one's bending anything. This has been a long-standing feature of the criminal justice system. All that's happening is that the people that it's being, the conditions or the requirements under which it is being requested or applied has expanded slightly. That's literally it. And, and again, this idea of, I would never believe that the justice system should discriminate on the basis of the color of your skin, as if this is the beginning of that happening, as if, mountains of academic research, mountains of policy research has not showed that disproportionately people of color, people with mental health issues, but specifically, people of color who experience poverty, people of color who experience mental health issues are much more likely to find themselves in the criminal justice system than in systems that actually are supporting them than their counterparts. The criminal justice has been discriminating against people because of the color of their skin, but we're only noticing it when this kind of somewhat fabricated version of events is coming to the fore. Helena, what do you make of two-tier care? Is there a two-tier policing system? Obviously, in a sense there is, but what do you think about the promotion of this myth that somehow the criminal justice system is softer on ethnic minorities, on trans people, on refugees, migrants? What do you make of that myth being promoted at, the highest level of the opposition at this point?
I fully agree with you. I think we do have a two-tier policing system, and it is the opposite of the one that we continually hear about in the media with this line that's being pushed, right? It's broadly within this kind of backlash against affirmative action and DEI and things like that that's come out from the right over the last few years, which is trying to paint this idea that these strategies to try and rebalance previous discrepancies in the level to which that people are being treated equitably by broader institutions, as if somehow that is unbalancing something that was balanced previously, rather than rebalancing something that was unbalanced previously. And this, of course, is anti-empirical. We have the data showing that a lot of these programs have been successful in combating that level of inequity along these specific groups, these specific demographics, and they've been successful in doing so. And maybe that you can unwind some of them, but not unwind others. Broadly, once you can see that you're coming towards some kind of continuum where we are trying to at least get rid of some of these imbalances that happened previously, right? Because no one actually wants two-tier justice. The idea that somehow what the right would believe is that the woke left are out there wanting to prioritize these certain identity groups because they believe in this neo-Marxist idea that they are the oppressed, therefore they must be given more than everybody else. No, we believe in an equitable justice system and we want to rebalance it. In the same way that I don't think that right-wingers are out here, they're just fundamentally believing that they should be prioritized and this is unbalancing their prioritization. I think that they personally believe that previously, before now, there was a balance and it is being unbalanced, right? The issue, of course, is trying to impart upon people who disagree with this in this particular realm that no, we do have the data. We do have the data that does show that these minority groups, these specific demographics do get treated more harshly. I mean, we've got the Casey review, even outside of sentencing, which is the purview of this specific discussion. When we look at the broader idea of how the police treat minorities, the attitude of police to minorities, the Casey review when it comes to the Metropolitan Police show that these levels of bias were already there, and which is why these programs are necessary to try and undo systemic bias within policing, and of course, back to the subject at hand, within the judiciary as well, when we look at the data that was pulled up earlier in this segment. What I would say, I do have a criticism of the sentencing guidelines that we're seeing here is similar to what Ash has been pointing out in her kind of media round that she's been doing promoting her new book that's come out recently, is that within this intersection analysis that looks at demographics, that looks at inequitable treatment, right? And throughout all of the lists of the different things that we've seen from what the Sentencing Council want to have being looked at in these future sentencing reviews and these guidelines, they didn't mention class. They didn't mention class once, right? I think there's a lot of social responsibility that's been imparted upon people in these kind of elite institutions like our judiciary, which is allowing people like the Sentencing Council to have a look at how we can redress those things. And I think the judiciary might get bought in on that. But one thing that's definitely going to be something that is out of the purview of these elite institutions is something like class. It is something like levels of poverty, which you correctly said earlier in your little bit there, that it is one of the biggest predictors of crime and of criminality. And of course, I would like to see some broader data, some academic literature on the ways in which sentencing is done, imparted upon people based upon their class background as well as other backgrounds too. And then if we're going to take this a holistic idea of who gets treated worse currently in terms of sentencing, I'd like to see that included, at least discussed more broadly. But of course, our media is full of people who are from posh backgrounds too, all Oxbridge and private school educated throughout our media. So are we going to see a class discussion about that? I find it difficult for that to happen. But what fundamentally most of this is about is this left and right split between equity versus equality. Whereas, again, we all want to see some level of, none of us want there to be two-tier justice, right? But in the right-leaning mind, the two-tier justice is having a set of rules that are different for other people. Once you say these people are subject to a different set of rules, therefore it is now unequal, regardless of whether there was an imbalance before. Whereas when it comes to the left, we will broadly want something that's equitable. We want people to be treated equitably. And sometimes, if there is implicit bias or systemic bias at the start among the equal rules, you have to be able to change them to create the equitability afterwards, right? And that's a fundamental ideological disagreement, right? And that's going to have to get teased out when it comes to how we look at future legislation in all sorts of areas, not just within how we look at sentencing. The problem, of course, is that broadly amongst the right, they've tried to paint themselves, or at least they did up until really the pandemic, as being facts over feelings, that the right believe in that the facts don't care about your feelings. Well, the facts show that these minority groups get treated worse by the judiciary. They get treated worse in terms of sentencing. This is what the facts say. The actual facts show that there is an imbalance already, that two-tier policing did exist, two-tier justice did exist before we had this discussion already, before even these new ideas of changing of sentencing guidelines were put forward by the Sentencing Council. So if you actually want to talk about facts rather than what you feel is two-tier justice because there is a rule that doesn't quite include the group that you belong to, well, maybe you actually didn't believe in facts over feelings all along. And that's something that's really dropped out of the right-wing lexicon, because if you want to believe in facts over feelings and you're on the right wing, you just have to discount all of academic literature, all of scientific literature as well, because a lot of it doesn't reify the priors that you've come to this discussion with. And when it comes to especially how we look at justice broadly amongst Western democracies, right? When it comes to the right, as every single time I seem to come on the show, I seem to have to bring up Wilhoit's law yet again, which is that when it comes to conservatism, they believe that the law should have in-groups with it which it protects but does not mind, and out-groups which it binds but does not protect. And that comes to the fore when they look at saying, well, hang on a minute, I personally believe that this particular element of our administrative structure, when it comes to the police, when it comes to the judiciary, should be there to protect my interests from this class of people who I believe are the kind of preeminent threat, right? Hence you say, well, there's this broader media demonization of ethnic minorities and of refugees and of people from minority backgrounds, because that's there to reify that belief they have that they should be protected from them, and that's what the law is there to do. No, the law is there to be equal for everybody. It's there to give equitable treatment to people, and that's why broadly the left believe in affirmative action and these broader DEI programs that seek to redress what has been shown by data to be historic imbalances. I just wish that we had class as a bigger factor in these discussions.
Yeah, I think the thing with the class question is that if you tried to bring class into this conversation, you would just blow the entire thing open because, and this is my personal view about policing, basically if you say that based on class background that, you have to have a pre-sentencing report, I don't think that the criminal justice system exists in order to really hold the rich to account. I think it exists to try to put a plot, like basically exists as a very insufficient and harmful, more often than not, insufficient and harmful response to the social problems that emerge from a class system, that emerge from economic inequality, that emerge from a system where the minority hold the wealth, the resources, the production, and the majority are given kind of the scraps. So if you say like based on class backgrounds, it's like, okay, that's basically like almost everyone that goes through the criminal justice system. And as I said, I would like to see pre-sentencing reports being used for everyone who goes through the criminal justice system, because when you actually look at people as human beings and you actually look at the context of how they have ended up where they have ended up, when you look at the story of the person, oftentimes you will come to the conclusion that chucking them into jail is not going to actually like resolve the root causes of why they are there. Like, class is the headline issue. I think when we see these racial disparities in the data, often that emerges from the fact that Black and brown people are disproportionately more working class. Like, and that doesn't mean there are more Black and brown people in the working class. It means that if you are Black or brown in this country, you are more likely to be working class than if you are a white person, because the upper middle class, the middle class, the rich are, again, disproportionately white people. And so that's how that's the way that it forms. That's kind of the relationship. And that becomes legible as a kind of institutional racism. But it is part and parcel of that broader question of the police and the question of class. If you'd like to hear more from Ash, her book Minority Rule is now available from the Novara Media bookshop. To order a copy, head to shop.novaramedia.com. If you have been anything like a functioning human adult for the last few weeks, you'll have noticed that the winds of change are blowing through the so-called established world order. US President Donald Trump has gleefully turned on allies like Canada and Mexico and cozied up to Russia over Ukraine. Meanwhile, European leaders have seen the writing on the wall for NATO and are scrambling to create an independent defense plan. Like I say, if you've been paying any attention at all, this will all be pretty evident. No surprise then that our most esteemed establishment journalists just don't get it. This was Emily Maitlis on the Newsagents podcast.
I was with a former head of state recently, and I asked exactly this question, that if America can't be depended on, if it is no longer a reliable ally, what happens to Europe? Is there anyone to come to help Europe? And this person said there is talk right now of China being the backstop. And I kind of laughed, actually. I mean, I instantly laughed in their face. And I said, what are you talking about? You know, China's not going to come to Europe's aid over an issue with Russia. And this person said, actually, no, China's really, really alarmed about an unstable Russia or an expansionist Russia or an even more expansionist Russia. And then the subject was sort of dropped, backed off. And I went away and I thought about it and I couldn't work out. I mean, they just said this is the talk in some circles now. Now, I'm telling you this because I found it instantly very hard to believe, very hard to see how it was credible.
I feel like for some of our journalists, every day they wake up like a newborn baby, seeing the world for the first time. So there you have someone who's supposed to be a serious journalist laughing in the face of a world leader suggesting China could partner with Europe defensively. But why is that such a crazy suggestion? China is already the EU's second biggest export market, the US being the first. Meanwhile, the bloc imports more Chinese goods than from any other markets, and trade relations between the two powers have been pretty robust. China is also a powerful military state with the second largest defense budget in the world, again after the US, and that is a budget that's growing. Earlier this week, the country pledged to increase defense spending by 7.2%. Even relatively conservative think tanks are now arguing that closer relations with China might be Europe's best bet. Chatham House has today published this article arguing that Europe should adapt to Trumpian shifts in world politics and engage with China over Ukraine. The problem for the establishment British media in this new reality is that they have constantly framed China as a threat to the UK. In 2024, the BBC alone published around one article every month positioning China as a threat. But the question is, was that assessment based on objective analysis, or rather the UK's adherence to US foreign policy? Last year, head of MI6 Richard Moore told the BBC that China, quote, aspires to displace the United States as the foremost power. Also last year, the heads of MI6 and the CIA described the rise of China as the main intelligence and geopolitical challenge of the century in a joint interview with the Financial Times. The British media has, almost without question, followed those lines. But now that things have changed so dramatically, US foreign policy brain journalists are having a hard time confronting reality. In the rest of the Maitlis video, you can literally watch the penny struggling to drop in real time.
But I guess there is a world in which China does feel it has to become part of this equation. If, as you say, it becomes America on one side with Russia and the rest of the world, Europe, whatever, China doesn't want to see America and Russia join forces in any shape. So does China actually start having a vested interest in terms of trying to keep the peace? And I feel ludicrous saying that. I mean, you know, we know what Xi is like. We know his own expansionist plans for Taiwan. We know that he wants to have a fourth term and rip up whatever a Chinese constitution looks like. But we also know that the Chinese at the moment are talking about world order rules in a way that America isn't. So it doesn't sound as batshit as it might once have done.
Helena, what do you make of Maitlis's response to the shocking idea that geopolitics happens on the basis of shared interest rather than feelings?
Well, that's it, right? It's all about economic interalliance at the end of the day. That's the most important part of geopolitical relationships is economic interalliance, right? And it's interesting, you know, you mentioned before how we continually get all of this saber rattling when it comes to how our governments, how our politicians, our media have discussed China as a geopolitical actor. Oh, China's pushing propaganda. Although they control TikTok, it's a propaganda machine there to be able to spy on you, for example. And whilst this is true, every country engages in this kind of propaganda, especially when it comes to the internet, right? They always have done. But when China does it, they said we need to close down the Confucius Institutes because they're trying to push the Chinese soft power. When it comes to the actual propaganda they get out of China, it's mostly just, well, did you know that China built a hospital in 2 weeks? Which, that's true. That is a piece of Chinese propaganda. They push this incredibly hard when it came to disseminating this as a piece of information, because it's supposed to be talking about the economic powerhouse that China is. It wants to have economic ties with the people who it is friends with. That has been the Chinese position for a very, very long time. This idea that China wants war, Chinese is being belligerent. Well, no, it wants economic power. It wants economic soft power. This is 100% true, right? Trying to act as though like Belt and Road initiatives and trying to gain some kind of Chinese state involvement in economic projects overseas, as this is being done out of altruistic nature of the Chinese economic position. That's just untrue. They're doing it because it is beneficial to China. But let's be real. It is mutually beneficial for both of the partners in these, even if it is slightly more so for Chinese interests than the people who it is doing Belt and Road initiatives with. So it's acting sort of like the America of old, except instead of being implicit and being an imposition on the country with which it wants economic ties to, right? Rather than trying to impose it through hard power, it is explicitly doing it through what at least somewhat mutually beneficial deals, right? Akala made this very clear when they were discussing China's influence within Jamaica, for example, in an interview. And he was saying, well, when it came to the British, when it came to Western, always wanting to impose this stuff on Jamaica. When it comes to China, they were very happy to just put economic investment into things like infrastructure into Montego Bay, for example. And that is far more agreeable, even if it's for soft power reasons, even if it's for geopolitical positioning. At least there is far more benefits to the people that it's doing it with than it otherwise would be if it was the United States or somebody, or even Russia, for example, who does things far more aggressively rather than in some form of mutual benefit like China does. It's why, as a socialist for a very, very long time, seeing as that we are moving to a multipolar world, we're moving to a world where we don't just have the US as the single geopolitical hegemon. It's why I've always been respectful of what Tito was like during the Cold War, where it was about creating a non-aligned movement. It was about trying to be friendly with as many geopolitical blocs as possible. It wasn't about belligerence. It wasn't about trying to see yourself as on one side of a great lake. It was saying, well, no, we want friends. We want to build infrastructure in the global south. We want to be able to create these connections between loads of different parts of the world. And that led to them being far more prosperous than they otherwise would have been if they hadn't done it, if they're just stuck with the Eastern or Western blocs at the time. And I think that's a really good thing about trying to have a better economic interrelationship with China. It would stop them from being more belligerent with Taiwan, which is the one thing that is the question looming over this, as somebody who believes in Taiwanese independence, which, the collapse really we're seeing in Taiwan of the KMT and of the Blue Coalition shows that the KMT's like one China positioning over claiming all of mainland China, that's really dissipating away from Taiwanese politics. There is more of a push for Taiwanese independence. And if we can have greater economic interreliance with China, if we can have China being part of conversations that we're having and part of the economic bloc that is, pro-green technology, which China is, which is pro trying to rein in the excesses of the corporations, which China is to a very large extent, and the EU is to a certain extent, is why America is trying to move away from the EU, because the EU is far more likely to, control what corporations do, right? There's a reason, even if it's something super simple. Tom Nicholas was pointing this out, like your iPhone having a USB-C charger. This was imposed upon Apple for the interests of consumers by European Union laws, right? China is very happy to control through state involvement and through being more harsh on rules, which is a closer relationship that European powers have with China than they ever would have with the US, especially when it comes to the US divesting from green projects as well and being entirely owned by an oligarchy. So even if we do have this relationship, we can push the rights issues that we care about. The treatment of people like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, things like what's happening with their position on Tibet. If we have a closer economic relationship with them, we can then have more leverage in trying to get them to put human rights as more central to the things that they are doing, which we have been the main criticism of China at the moment, is the way that they have treated certain minorities within their borders. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing out of this changing world order, what we're seeing with the United States becoming more insular, becoming more isolationist in terms of its policy outside of how it deals with Israel and the Middle East, is that the Xi Jinping strategy of doing nothing and winning seems to be the best position right now.
Thanks for joining me tonight, Helena.
Always a pleasure to join you.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.